The crisp September morning started like any other at the bustling Harrison County Courthouse. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps as the morning dew still clung to the manicured lawn. It was exactly 7:30 a.m., the perfect time to arrive, according to the judge who had perfected this routine over his 15 years on the bench. He pulled into his usual parking spot, gathering his worn leather briefcase from the passenger seat of his modest sit-in. Despite being one of the most respected judges in the district, he never saw the need for flashy cars or expensive accessories. His father had taught him that true respect came from actions, not appearances. The judge was wearing his comfortable weekend clothes, a simple polo shirt and khaki pants. Like many judges, he preferred changing into his robes at the office rather than driving in them. His Courthouse ID badge hung from his lapel, catching the early morning light as he walked toward the entrance. As he approached the building, he noticed a slight change in the usual morning rhythm. There was a new face at the security desk, an officer he hadn't seen before. Nothing unusual about that. The courthouse often rotated security personnel. Still, something felt different about this morning. The air seemed to carry an extra weight, like the heaviness before a storm. The judge smiled warmly as he walked up the steps, the same way he had for the past 15 years. He could already smell the coffee from the break room upstairs, where Mrs. Wilson, the court secretary, always had a fresh pot brewing by 7:15. He was thinking about that first cup of coffee, about the stack of cases waiting on his desk, about the young law students who would be observing court proceedings today. His mind was already racing through his morning schedule. First, the early meeting with the court clerks about the new filing system, then the Thompson custody case at 9:30, followed by what promised to be a challenging criminal hearing at 11. He had spent the previous evening reviewing case files, making sure he was thoroughly prepared for each situation. The judge loved these quiet morning moments before the courthouse came alive with the day's activities. It was his time to center himself, to remember the weight of responsibility that came with his position. Every decision he made would impact real lives, real families, real futures. He never took that lightly. He nodded to the maintenance staff as he passed them, hard-working folks who kept the building running smoothly. He knew most of them by name, had heard stories about their children, shared jokes during chance encounters in the hallways. That's the kind of person he was, someone who believed that every role in the justice system, from the janitor to the Chief Justice, deserved equal respect. Little did he know that in just a few moments, his regular morning routine would transform into something entirely unexpected. The new security officer had spotted him approaching the judge's entrance and was already moving to intercept him. In those few steps between the parking lot and the courthouse door, everything was about to change. The quiet morning was about to become the backdrop for a story that would challenge perspectives, spark important conversations, and ultimately lead to unexpected positive changes in their community. But for now, the judge was simply walking toward the door, his mind on his cases, his coffee, and the day ahead. The security officer stood straighter, adjusting his uniform and badge. His face showed the stern determination of someone new to their post, eager to prove their worth. The stage was set for an encounter that would ripple through the courthouse halls and beyond, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted on this ordinary September morning. The new security officer stood at his post, shoulders squared and jaw set with determination. It was only his third day at the courthouse after transferring from a smaller county facility. He'd spent the morning checking IDs and directing visitors, determined to prove himself worthy of this prestigious assignment. When he spotted someone in casual clothes heading toward the judge's entrance, his training kicked in. In his mind, judges were supposed to look a certain way: formal suits, commanding presence, briefcases that cost more than his monthly salary. The man approaching in a polo shirt and khakis didn't fit that image at all. "Sir, this entrance is for authorized personnel only," the officer called out, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his belt. His voice carried across the morning air, sharp and authoritative. A few early morning courthouse workers turned their heads, curious about the confrontation unfolding. The judge paused, slightly taken aback by the tone. In 15 years, he'd never been stopped at this entrance. His ID badge was clearly visible on his lapel, catching the morning sunlight. With practiced patience, he gestured to his credentials. "Good morning, officer. I'm one of the district judges here. My ID is right here. But the officer had already made up his mind. Something about this didn't sit right with him. He'd been told to be extra vigilant, and he was someone who didn't match his idea of what a judge should look like, trying to use the restricted entrance. I'm going to need you to use the main entrance, sir. All visitors need to go through proper security screening. The judge maintained his composure, though he couldn't help but notice how the officer's hand remained near his weapon. He'd faced situations like this before, too many times to count. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I've been a judge in this courthouse for 15 years. My ID badge is current and valid. By now, a small crowd of courthouse employees had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. Many recognized the judge immediately. They'd seen him preside over cases, shared elevator rides with him, exchanged greetings in the hallways. Some looked uncomfortable, others concerned, but all remained silent, waiting to see how this would play out. The officer stepped closer, his face flushing slightly. Sir, I don't know how things worked before, but under my watch, everyone follows proper procedure. I can't just let people walk in because they claim to be a judge. His voice carried a hint of skepticism that made several onlookers wince. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting stark shadows across the courthouse steps. The judge felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself, but for every person who'd ever been judged by appearances rather than credentials. He could feel his heart beating a bit faster, but his voice remained steady and clear. Officer, I appreciate your dedication to security, the judge began, his tone professional but firm. However, my ID badge is genuine, and I have every right to enter through this door. Perhaps we could call your supervisor to clear this up. He maintained eye contact, his dignity intact despite the growing discomfort of the situation. The tension in the air was almost tangible now. Other courthouse employees were arriving, forming a wider circle around the scene. Some had pulled out their phones, though none were recording. They just wanted to be ready if things escalated. The morning had transformed from routine to remarkable in just a few short minutes. The security officer shifted his weight, clearly struggling with the situation. His training told him to stand his ground, but something in the judge's calm demeanor made him uncertain. The ID badge looked real enough, but it went against everything he'd assumed about how a judge should look and act. Just as the standoff seemed about to reach a crucial turning point, fate decided to add another player to this unfolding drama. The sound of car doors closing echoed across the parking lot, and footsteps approached from behind. Someone else was about to join this tense morning scene, someone who would change everything. The courthouse steps had become an impromptu stage, with the morning sun now fully risen and casting harsh light on the scene. The judge stood calmly, his courthouse ID still visible on his lapel, while the security officer maintained his confrontational stance. The growing crowd of courthouse employees watched with a mixture of concern and disbelief. A veteran court clerk hurried down the steps, her heels clicking against the concrete. She had worked at the courthouse for over 2 decades and knew every judge by sight. Officer, she called out, her voice carrying years of authority. There seems to be a misunderstanding. This is one of our most respected. The security officer cut her off with a raised hand. Ma'am, please step back. This is a security matter. His voice had grown louder, more insistent, drawing even more attention from people arriving for the day's proceedings. The officer's face had reddened, his pride now fully invested in this confrontation. The judge took a deep breath, remembering similar moments throughout his career, moments when his position and accomplishments seemed to dissolve in the face of preconceptions. He'd dealt with this before, but never at his own courthouse, never at the very steps where he administered justice. Officer, the judge spoke again, his voice remaining measured despite the growing tension. I understand you're new here, but my identity can be easily verified. There are several ways we can resolve this without escalating the situation. He gestured toward his ID badge again, maintaining his professional demeanor. The crowd had grown larger now. Legal assistants, attorneys arriving for morning hearings, and other courthouse staff gathered at a respectful distance. Some whispered among themselves, others shook their heads in disbelief. A young law clerk pulled out his phone, then quickly put it away, unsure of how to help. The security officer's radio crackled with routine morning communications, but he ignored it. He was too focused on what he saw as a potential security breach. "Sir, if you're really a judge, why aren't you dressed like one? Why are you trying to use this entrance? Something doesn't add up here." The court clerk tried again, stepping forward despite the officer's previous warning. "Officer, please listen. I've worked here for 20 years, and I can assure you." But once again, the officer cut her off, this time more forcefully. "Everyone needs to step back," he demanded, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "This is a restricted entrance, and until I can verify proper credentials, no one is getting through." His hand remained near his belt, adding an unnecessary edge to an already tense situation. The judge noticed how some of the younger courthouse employees looked away, unable to watch this display of misplaced authority. He thought about all the times he'd spoken to law students about justice and fairness, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of appearances. Now those words were being tested in real time. A few attorneys in the crowd began whispering among themselves, some pulling out business cards, ready to step in if needed. The judge had presided over their cases, earned their respect through years of fair and thoughtful rulings. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The morning air grew thicker with tension as more people arrived for the day's proceedings. The usual bustle of courthouse activity had come to a standstill, all eyes focused on this unnecessary confrontation. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching out painfully. Just then, footsteps sounded from the parking lot, quick and purposeful. Someone was approaching who would change the entire dynamic of this situation. The crowd parted slightly, turning to look at the new arrival. The next few moments would transform this confrontation into something none of them expected, a lesson that would resonate far beyond the courthouse steps. The click of determined footsteps drew everyone's attention. The Chief Justice of the District Court had arrived, her presence commanding immediate respect. She took in the scene before her with practiced eyes. The security officer's defensive stance, the judge's calm demeanor, and the gathering crowd of courthouse employees. She had just parked her car when she noticed the commotion at the judge's entrance. With 25 years of experience on the bench, she could read a situation quickly, and what she saw troubled her deeply. The Chief Justice had worked hard to build an inclusive courthouse environment, and now this scene threatened to undermine years of progress. "Good morning, everyone," she called out, her voice clear and authoritative. The murmuring crowd fell silent. Even the birds seemed to quiet down as she approached. The security officer turned, his hand finally moving away from his belt as he recognized the Chief Justice from his orientation photos. "Your Honor," he stammered, suddenly less certain of his position. The Chief Justice nodded briefly in his direction before turning to her colleague. The look they exchanged spoke volumes, years of shared experiences, shared challenges, and shared understanding passing between them in a single glance. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said, addressing the officer directly. "The gentleman you're preventing from entering is one of our most distinguished judges. He's presided over more than 1,000 cases in this very courthouse." Her tone was professional but carried an edge of disappointment. The security officer's face flushed deeper, realization dawning in his eyes. He looked again at the judge's ID badge, seeing it clearly for the first time. The crowd watched as the officer's posture changed, his shoulders dropping slightly as the weight of his mistake settled over him. The Chief Justice stepped closer, lowering her voice so only those nearest could hear. "Officer, I understand you're new here and taking your duties seriously. That's commendable. However, we need to discuss proper procedures and, more importantly, proper judgment." Her words were firm but not unkind. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the courthouse steps. Some members of the crowd began to disperse, heading inside to prepare for the day's proceedings. Others lingered, watching this moment of reckoning unfold. The tension in the air began to shift, transforming into something else, a potential learning opportunity. The judge, who had maintained his composure throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "Chief Justice, thank you for your intervention. Perhaps this situation offers us all a chance to reflect and grow." His words carried no bitterness, only a genuine desire to turn this moment into something meaningful. The court clerk who had tried to intervene earlier stepped forward again, this time offering to escort the judge to his chambers. But the judge held up his hand, indicating he wasn't quite ready to leave. He saw something in the officer's face, shame mixed with confusion, and perhaps a willingness to learn. The Chief Justice nodded, understanding her colleague's intention. She'd seen him handle difficult situations before, always finding ways to build bridges rather than walls. "Officer," she said, "I believe we should continue this discussion in my office, and I think my colleague here has some valuable insights to share." The morning breeze carried the sound of the courthouse clock striking 8. The day's regular activities would begin soon: hearings, trials, the steady march of justice. But for now, on these steps, another kind of justice was unfolding. Not the kind written in law books, but the kind that changes hearts and minds. As the small group prepared to move inside, the remaining onlookers could sense they were witnessing something important. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding at a courthouse entrance. It was about learning, growth, and the possibility of change, and it was far from over. Inside the Chief Justice's office, the morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The security officer stood near the door, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. The room felt both grand and oppressive as the weight of his actions began to sink in. Family photos lined the walls, showing both judges at community events, speaking at schools, and working with local youth programs. Each image told a story of dedication to justice and community service. The officer's eyes lingered on a photograph of the judge he'd stopped, showing him receiving a Community Leadership Award. "Please have a seat," the Chief Justice gestured to a chair. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. The officer sat down stiffly, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around the collar. His mind raced back through the morning's events, replaying each moment with painful clarity. The veteran judge leaned against the desk, his casual polo shirt and khakis now seeming to carry a different kind of authority. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been coming through those doors for 15 years. Every morning, same time, same entrance." He paused, letting the words sink in. The officer's hands twisted in his lap. "Your Honor, he started, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain decisions he was only now beginning to understand? The sound of the courthouse coming to life drifted through the closed door, footsteps, voices, the usual morning bustle. "When you looked at me," the judge continued, "what did you see? Be honest. This isn't about punishment, it's about understanding." His words carried no anger, only a genuine desire to create a moment of learning. The officer swallowed hard, finding courage in the judge's calm demeanor. I saw someone who didn't fit what I thought a judge should look like. I made assumptions without." His voice trailed off as the full impact of his actions hit him. Outside the window, a group of law students climbed the courthouse steps, carrying heavy books and bigger dreams. The Chief Justice watched them for a moment before speaking. "Our assumptions can be powerful things," she said quietly. "They can also be dangerous." The morning light shifted, highlighting the officer's face as he struggled with this revelation. 20 years of law enforcement experience, and yet this moment was teaching him something new. His training had taught him to be alert, to watch for threats, but had it also taught him to see threats where none existed? "I've spent my career trying to make this courthouse a place of true justice," the judge said, straightening up. "That means justice for everyone, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing. When you stopped me this morning, you didn't just question my credentials, you questioned everything this building stands for." The officer's face flushed with shame, but something else was happening too. A door was opening in his mind, letting in new light, new understanding. He looked up at the two judges, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice steady despite his emotion. "I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment. I didn't think I." He struggled to find the right words to express his transformation. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking this moment of change. Through the window, the morning sun continued to climb, promising a new day, and with it, the possibility of growth, understanding, and transformation. The Chief Justice smiled slightly, recognizing the genuine regret and desire to learn in the officer's voice. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a much more important conversation. After the meeting in the Chief Justice's office, something unexpected happened. Instead of filing a complaint or demanding disciplinary action, the judge made a different choice. "Would you join me in my chambers?" he asked the officer. "I think we could both benefit from a conversation." The walk to the judge's chambers was quiet, their footsteps echoing through the marble hallways. Courthouse staff glanced their way, curious about this unusual pairing. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow as they walked. The judge's chambers were warm and welcoming, with law books lining the walls and a coffee maker bubbling in the corner. A worn leather couch sat against one wall, and family photos dotted his desk. It felt more like a living room than an office, designed to put people at ease. "Coffee," the judge offered, already reaching for 2 mugs. The officer nodded, grateful for something to do with his hands. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the room, creating a comfortable atmosphere for what could have been an uncomfortable conversation. "You know," the judge began, settling into his chair, "I wasn't always a judge. 25 years ago, I was a young law student walking into this very courthouse for the first time." He passed a steaming mug to the officer. "I remember being stopped at the entrance then too." The officer looked up, surprised. His coffee remained untouched as he listened. The judge continued, "The security officer that day made the same assumptions you did. But instead of letting it go, I decided to become part of the change I wanted to see." Sunlight played across the room as morning traffic hummed outside. Through the window, they could see people coming and going, each with their own story, their own journey to justice. The officer shifted in his seat, finally taking a sip of his coffee. "I grew up in a small town," the officer said quietly. "We didn't. I never." He struggled to find the right words. The judge waited patiently, understanding the difficulty of confronting long-held beliefs. "Tell me about your journey to law enforcement," the judge encouraged. "What made you choose this path?" His question opened a door, allowing the officer to share his story. As he spoke about his desire to protect and serve, his voice grew stronger, more confident. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on their backgrounds, experiences, and the different ways life has shaped their perspectives. The judge shared stories from his early days as an attorney, the challenges he faced, and the mentors who had helped him along the way. "You know what I've learned in my years on the bench?" the judge asked, refilling their coffee cups. "Justice isn't just about laws and procedures. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, beyond our first impressions." The officer nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "I always thought I was good at reading people," he admitted, "but today showed me I have a lot to learn." His words carried the weight of genuine reflection. Outside the chamber windows, clouds drifted across the sky, changing the patterns of light in the room. The courthouse buzzed with activity, hearings beginning, lawyers conferring with clients, justice moving forward in its steady way. "What happens now?" the officer asked, his voice carrying both concern and hope. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering the question. This moment could be more than just a resolution to a morning's conflict. It could be the beginning of real change. The simple office had become a space of transformation, where two different worlds could meet and learn from each other. The coffee pot gurgled as it made a fresh batch, filling the air with its comforting scent. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like sharing a cup of coffee and really listening to another person's story. As their conversation deepened, the morning light shifted in the judge's chambers, casting warm shadows across the room. The officer leaned forward, his coffee cup long empty, as he shared more about his background. "I grew up in a town of just 3,000 people," he explained. "Everyone looked the same, thought the same, lived the same way." The judge listened intently, noticing how the officer's shoulders had relaxed since their first encounter at the courthouse steps. Sometimes understanding begins with simply being heard. A clock ticked softly on the wall, marking this moment of connection. "In my academy days," the officer continued, his voice growing more confident, "they taught us to look for threats, to trust our instincts. But nobody ever taught us how those instincts might be shaped by where we came from, what we were used to seeing." The judge nodded, remembering his own journey. "When I first started practicing law," he shared, "I walked into a courtroom and someone asked me if I was the defendant. It stung, but it taught me something important about perspectives and assumptions." Outside the window, courthouse visitors came and went, each with their own stories, their own biases to overcome. A young law clerk hurried past, arms full of files, while an elderly couple sat on a bench, waiting for their grandson's hearing. "You know what's interesting?" the judge continued, standing to stretch his legs. Every person who walks through those courthouse doors brings their whole life story with them, their fears, their hopes, their prejudices. The challenge is learning to see beyond our first impressions. The officer glanced at a framed photo on the wall, the judge at a community outreach program, surrounded by children of all backgrounds. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. In my old job, things seemed simpler, black and white, right and wrong. A gentle breeze rustled papers on the desk as the judge opened a window, letting in fresh air. Life's rarely that simple, he responded. Each person we meet is like a book. You can't judge its contents by the cover alone. The officer stood up, walking to the window. Below, a diverse crowd moved through the Courthouse Plaza. I see them differently now, he said quietly. All those people down there, each one has a story I know nothing about. The judge joined him at the window. That's where real change begins, he said. When we start seeing people as individuals, not categories. When we question our assumptions instead of acting on them automatically. A moment of understanding passed between them. The morning's confrontation had transformed into something unexpected, a chance for both men to grow, to learn, to see the world through different eyes. Back in my hometown, the officer shared, his voice thoughtful, I never had to think about these things. Everyone I knew lived life pretty much the same way. Coming here, it's opened my eyes to how big the world really is. The judge smiled, remembering his own journey of growth. That's the beauty of working in a place like this, he said, gesturing to the courthouse around them. Every day brings new perspectives, new chances to learn from each other. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. The morning's first hearing would begin soon, but both men knew this wasn't the end of their discussion. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected moments. As they prepared to return to their duties, the officer paused. Thank you, he said simply, for taking the time to talk instead of just filing a complaint, for helping me see things differently. His words carried the weight of genuine gratitude. The judge nodded, understanding the courage it takes to confront one's own biases. This is how we make real change, he replied. One conversation at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time. In the weeks that followed their conversation, the courthouse began to notice subtle changes in the security officer's approach to his duties. His greetings became warmer, his stance more welcoming. While he remained vigilant in his duties, there was a new awareness in his eyes, a deeper understanding of the community he served. One morning, as a nervous young mother struggled with a stroller at the security checkpoint, the officer stepped forward to help. He noticed her hands shaking as she tried to fold the stroller for the scanner. Instead of rushing her through, he took a moment to explain the process calmly, helping her feel at ease. Take your time, he said gently, remembering the judge's words about seeing people as individuals with their own stories. The woman's grateful smile reminded him how small acts of kindness could change someone's entire courthouse experience. The officer didn't stop at just changing his own behavior. During morning briefings with his fellow officers, he began sharing insights from his experience. You know, he'd say, our job isn't just about security, it's about making everyone who walks through these doors feel respected. His supervisor noticed the change too. One afternoon, while reviewing security protocols, the officer raised his hand. I think we need additional training, he suggested, not just about procedures, but about understanding the different communities we serve. The suggestion was met with thoughtful nods. Word of his transformation spread through the courthouse. The judge, watching from his chambers, saw how one morning's confrontation had sparked a chain reaction of positive changes. Legal assistants commented on the warmer atmosphere at the security checkpoint. Public defenders noticed their clients felt more at ease entering the building. The officer enrolled himself in voluntary diversity training programs offered by the county. During these sessions, he often shared his story, not as a source of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of growth and change. I thought I knew what a judge looked like, he'd tell the group. But I learned that assumptions can blind us to the truth right in front of us. Other security officers began following his example. The morning security checks, once a source of tension for many courthouse visitors, became opportunities for building trust. The officers learned to balance their duties with a deeper awareness of the human stories behind each face. During lunch breaks, the officer could often be found in the courthouse library reading about civil rights history and community relations. His commitment to learning impressed even the most skeptical Courthouse staff. "He's really taking this seriously," one clerk remarked to another as they passed him engrossed in a book. The judge noticed these changes with quiet satisfaction. One morning, passing through security, he saw the officer helping an elderly man with his walker. The care and respect in the officer's actions spoke volumes about how far he'd come. In the break room, conversations began to change too. Instead of just discussing procedures and protocols, officers shared stories about the people they'd helped, the connections they'd made. The officers' experience had opened up new ways of thinking about their role in the justice system. The Courthouse administration took notice. They began developing new training programs based on the officers' suggestions, recognizing that true security came not just from following procedures, but from building trust with the community they served. Even the physical atmosphere of the security checkpoint changed. While maintaining professional vigilance, the officers created a more welcoming environment. Simple changes, like clearer signage in multiple languages and a more organized flow, made a big difference to Courthouse visitors. As autumn approached, the officer's dedication to growth and change had become an inspiration to others. His story proved that one moment of confrontation, handled with wisdom and compassion, could lead to lasting positive change. 1 year after that fateful morning on the Courthouse steps, something remarkable happened. The judge and the security officer stood together at a podium in the courthouse's main hall, launching a new community outreach program. The room was packed with Courthouse staff, law enforcement officers, and community members, all gathered to witness this unexpected partnership. "A year ago, I stopped a judge at these very doors," the officer began, his voice steady and clear. "What could have been a moment of conflict became a turning point, not just for me, but for this entire courthouse." The audience listened intently, many nodding in recognition of the story they'd heard about but never fully knew. The program they created was simple but powerful: regular meetings between law enforcement and local communities held right there in the courthouse. These weren't just formal presentations, but real conversations where people could share their experiences, concerns, and hopes for better understanding. The judge watched proudly as the officer explained their vision. The nervous, defensive man from that morning a year ago had transformed into a confident advocate for change. "Every person who walks through these doors has a story," the officer said, echoing words he'd learned in the judge's chambers. "Our job is to make sure they feel heard and respected while we keep everyone safe." Their program quickly gained attention beyond the courthouse walls. Other districts began sending representatives to learn from their example. The local law enforcement academy incorporated their training methods into their curriculum, ensuring new officers would start their careers with a better understanding of the communities they served. On quiet afternoons, the judge would sometimes pause at his chamber window, watching the officer lead courthouse tours for school groups. He'd point out the important role each person played in the justice system, from the maintenance staff to the judges. "Everyone here," he'd tell the students, "helps make justice possible." The courthouse itself felt different now. The security checkpoint, once a place of tension, had become a model of efficient, respectful screening. Officers greeted visitors with genuine warmth while maintaining professional vigilance. Signs in multiple languages welcomed people, and a help desk staffed by volunteers assisted those navigating the system for the first time. One morning, a young lawyer stopped the judge in the hallway. "Your Honor," she said, "I've been practicing law for 3 years, but I've never felt as welcome in a courthouse as I do here." Her words confirmed what they'd hoped, that small changes could make a big difference in how people experience justice. The officer's example inspired others to examine their own biases and assumptions. Regular discussion groups formed among courthouse staff, where people could openly share their experiences and learn from each other. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were always honest and respectful. As the seasons changed, their story spread through legal circles and law enforcement communities. Other courthouses reached out, asking for guidance in creating similar programs. What began as a tense confrontation had grown into a movement for positive change. The Chief Justice, watching all of this unfold, often reflected on that morning a year ago. Sometimes, she told new judges at their orientation, the most important moments in justice happen outside the courtroom. She would then share the story of the judge and the officer as an example of how understanding and compassion could transform an entire institution. 1 year later, standing in that packed courthouse hall, the judge and officer shared a knowing look. Their story had become more than just a personal transformation. It had become a blueprint for change, a reminder that justice works best when everyone feels seen, heard, and respected. As they finished their presentation, the applause echoing through the hall carried the weight of real appreciation. This wasn't just about one morning's confrontation anymore. It was about the countless lives touched, the perspectives changed, and the future they were helping to build, one conversation at a time.